Have you ever witnessed a moment so shocking it left an entire room in stunned silence? Imagine this, the heart of a lively neighborhood, a cozy grocery store buzzing with activity. Families wandered through the aisles, shopping carts rattling along the tiled floor. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the hum of quiet conversations, and the occasional laughter of children echoed in the background. Among the shoppers, moving with his signature cool demeanor, was none other than Snoop Dogg. Casually dressed in a hoodie and jeans, he blended effortlessly into the scene, holding a basket in one hand while reaching for a bag of oranges with the other. To most people in the store, he was just another customer. What happened next, however, would leave everyone speechless and teach an unforgettable lesson about courage and compassion. Before we dive into this gripping story, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Motivation for Success, for more powerful tales that inspire and uplift. Now, let's continue with what really happened on this unforgettable day. The air of calm was abruptly interrupted by a voice that cut through the store like a sharp blade. "You people don't belong here," the man said, his tone filled with disdain. He was an elderly man named Mr. Kane, with neatly combed silver hair and a crisp button-down shirt that matched his stern demeanor. His voice wasn't loud, but it was loud enough to silence the chatter of the store. His piercing glare was locked on Snoop, his arms crossed tightly as though daring him to respond. At first, Snoop froze, thinking perhaps he had misheard. But as Mr. Kane followed up with, "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" the intent was unmistakable. The entire store seemed to pause. Shoppers turned their heads, their faces a mix of confusion, disbelief, and discomfort. The hum of the refrigerators seemed louder now in the absence of voices, and even the children who had been laughing moments before grew silent. Snoop raised his head slowly, meeting Mr. Kane's unrelenting gaze. For a moment, the world around him seemed to shrink, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on him. He saw the determination in Mr. Kane's stance, arms crossed, chin slightly lifted, ready for a fight. 1,000 possible responses ran through Snoop's mind. He could lash out, match the man's hostility, or storm off in frustration. But as the seconds ticked by, he did something remarkable. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and allowed calmness to settle over him. The crowd watched with bated breath, expecting an argument or worse. Some looked on nervously, unsure of how far this confrontation might escalate. But Snoop's response wasn't what anyone expected. "Sir," he said, his voice measured and deliberate, "do you even realize what you just said?" The question wasn't aggressive or confrontational, it was reflective, as though Snoop was offering Mr. Kane a chance to think about his words. But Mr. Kane didn't reflect. Instead, he doubled down, crossing his arms tighter. "I said what I said," he replied, his voice rising slightly. "This is my country, and people like you don't belong here." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A young woman near the bread aisle clutched her shopping cart nervously. A teenage employee stocking shelves froze in place, his eyes darting between Snoop and Mr. Kane. The tension was almost suffocating. Snoop remained calm. He didn't step forward, nor did he raise his voice. Instead, he let the silence stretch, giving Mr. Kane's words the opportunity to echo in everyone's minds. After a long pause, Snoop nodded slowly, picking his words carefully. "All right," he said. "Let's talk about that." He set his basket on the floor, straightened his posture, and turned to face the growing crowd. His calmness was disarming, almost unsettling in its strength. "You said I don't belong here," Snoop began, his voice steady and firm. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." The store, now utterly silent, seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the hum of the refrigerators seemed to fade into the background. "My great-grandfather was born right here in this country," Snoop continued, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "But before that, my ancestors were brought here against their will. They were forced to work, sweat, and bleed to build this very land you call yours." Mr. Kane's smug expression faltered slightly, but he didn't interrupt. The crowd, however, was transfixed. My grandfather, Snoop went on, fought in a war for this country. He put his life on the line, just like every other soldier. But when he came back, he couldn't sit at the same counters or drink from the same fountains as the people he fought alongside. Snoop's gaze swept across the crowd, meeting their eyes one by one. And my parents? They fought, too. Not with guns, but with dignity. They worked hard, taught me respect, and raised me to believe in equality, even when the world didn't always show it. Turning back to Mr. Kane, Snoop's voice softened, though his words carried undeniable strength. So when you tell me I don't belong here, you're not just insulting me. You're insulting every sacrifice my family made. You're insulting every person who fought for the freedoms you take for granted. The weight of Snoop's words hung heavy in the air. Mr. Kane shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed with embarrassment. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Around him, the crowd began to murmur. Some nodded in agreement, while others whispered to each other, their expressions thoughtful. Finally, a man near the frozen foods section stepped forward. "He's right," the man said, his voice breaking the silence. "We've got to be better than this." His words seemed to break a spell. Others began chiming in, some agreeing, some applauding softly, and others simply nodding their approval. Even those who had initially stayed quiet now found their voices. Mr. Kane, visibly shaken, looked around the crowd as though searching for an ally. But there were none. His hostility gave way to something else, perhaps shame, perhaps regret. Without a word, he turned and wheeled his cart toward the exit. As the tension eased, several shoppers approached Snoop to thank him. A young woman placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "What you said back there, it was powerful. Thank you." Snoop smiled faintly, picking up his basket. "Sometimes," he said, almost to himself, "it's not about winning an argument. It's about making sure the truth gets heard." He finished his shopping quietly. The atmosphere in the store was noticeably calmer now, almost reflective. At the checkout line, the young cashier who had been watching the scene earlier looked up at him and said, "Not many people would have handled that the way you did. Thank you for standing up." Snoop nodded, his tone warm but firm. Grace is the only way to break through hate. The story didn't end there. Over the next few days, news of the incident spread through the neighborhood. People shared what had happened with friends and family, recounting how Snoop had turned an ugly moment into a powerful lesson. It wasn't just about standing up to hate, it was about doing so with dignity and compassion. Even Mr. Kane, sitting alone in his kitchen that evening, couldn't shake Snoop's words. For the first time, he began to question the beliefs he had held for so long. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was a start. This story isn't just about a grocery store confrontation, it's a reflection of the power of truth, compassion, and courage. Snoop's response shows us that standing up for what's right doesn't need to be loud or confrontational. Often, the most powerful response is one grounded in grace and dignity. Let this story inspire you to be a voice for justice and understanding. Stand against hate, support those in need, and choose kindness whenever you can. Remember, even the smallest actions can create ripples of positive change. For more stories that uplift, inspire, and remind us of the strength found in humanity, subscribe to our channel, Motivation for Success. Together, we can create a world where empathy and understanding lead the way forward.